One of the questions that keeps coming up while I've been doing streams or having personal conversations and generally talking about the story of the upcoming marathon game has been, how do the runners actually fit into the story within the context of the narrative information that we've already received? The initial trailer that we got in 2023 alongside the ARG and the Vidoc really led a lot of people to believe that we were not going to have these hero-like characters, but rather very customizable or modular entities or player characters that we would be able to customize in ways like changing individual pieces of armor, equipment, or abilities. Now, going back and re-listening to the words and the language that was used specifically within the Vidoc, maybe that was a leap or, kind of a jump in logic that people made to come to that conclusion, given that I'm pretty sure the language that was used was basically just tied to having players, maintain a sense of customizability so they can individualize themselves. And that doesn't necessarily ring true to the idea that they were talking specifically about gameplay mechanics, but also we have seen reports saying that there were large changes in the gameplay from the original state, so maybe that is what they were intending and now we've shifted to this. And obviously last year there was the IGN hero shooter article when it was announced that Joe Ziegler, who was coming from a hero shooter game, Valorant, was now going to be the game director for Marathon. And we've now seen from the stuff in April of 2025 exactly how they're going to implement this. I think it's fair to say hero shooter elements and characters into the narrative of Marathon. But what hasn't been fully explained is exactly how the story is now going to structure itself around characters that we have not really even still been entirely introduced to. And I do think a separate discussion would be about why Bungie is seemingly running away from this term hero shooter, and I'm sure that's tied to a lot of other stuff outside the game, like Concord and obligations to Sony and marketing language and PR training. But I do, just as a separate thing, think that it would be really nice to hear the people making the game, the gameplay designers, really give a thorough or have a thorough conversation with the public and the audience and the community about why they came to the decision and why that works more with the game that they've developed, which is something they've touched on. But I do think there is more to kind of explain and illuminate within that realm. And I do hope they come back to it. But speaking strictly from a story perspective, it also opens up a lot of questions because, like we were talking about with the 2023 materials, a lot of people felt like, to me at least, came to the conclusion that the experience we were going to have as the player was that we were an individual mercenary runner, blue-collar worker, one of many on this planet who had come there for riches and are now entangled in this insane mess that these megacorps and interstellar governments has gotten humanity into, right? And that the story was going to be our exploration and uncovering the secrets and facts of what's really going on in Tau Ceti now, what happened to the colonists, what is the true inner workings of these mega organizations that are clearly having a lot of control over this realm as well now, that it was going to be a story that we experienced, but we were not like directly a part of, that the player character as a, extraction shooter, not like consistent, not named, that was how originally it seemed like the narrative was going to be told, that we were going to be disconnected from the story, but experiencing it, and the story would shift based off how we chose to interact with it, but we weren't coming into it with some sort of legacy or historical context as to what our character's purpose was and what was going on here in Tau Ceti. Whereas now, since it's been revealed in 2025, we had the Marathon Alpha, there are very specific named runners who have a specific appearance that is consistent every time you load into the match, albeit with the possibility for skins later on, hinted at through dev interviews and stuff like that during the alpha, and that these characters even have backstories that were portrayed in little blurbs on the runner page in the alpha. For example, Glitch is a Martian freedom fighter, Locust was ex-UESC, so these really are individual characters within the Marathon universe who, for all intents and purposes, despite not having a lot of information, for them, except that blurb I talked about, and then a handful of voice lines within the game that really are just game mechanics kind of announcing what's occurring on screen as like a hint or tool for player engagement. They kind of, just by having that small amount of information, become very substantial characters of consequence within the Marathon universe, because all other characters have so little information truly revealed about them. Bernard Strauss is maybe one of, if not the most consequential character outside of anybody or anything that you interact with within the story of the original games itself. And we really have, a handful of writing. We have Durandal speaking about him. We have Durandal and Tycho communicating about him. We have the terminal log entry from him in Marathon 1, but it's really so little that we don't have a full grasp or scope of what his intentions were, and we're really trying to work backwards to uncover what his true goals were. Who was he actually aligned with? Was he aligned with Maida? What was the purpose? How did he know about the Mjolnir cyborgs that were on board the Marathon? And why did he withhold that information from Marcus Tiberius Buendia, the president of the UESC, prior to the launch of the Marathon? These are all questions that we try to understand, where the characters that we are experiencing, Durandal and the security officer and Tycho and Leela, and we try to work backwards and figure out what he was doing, right? So just by having a direct kind of backstory for these characters, in a way, they become very, very prominent within the universe. And like I said, I kind of made a list here, but think about it. Security Officer, Durandal, Leela, Tycho, and those three are AI. And then we have Tafir, we have Robert Blake. I mean, there's a very small list of prominent characters within the Marathon universe. And so clearly it seems like by introducing these characters with these names and backstories, that they're going to have a very integral part of the narrative. With all that being said, what we've seen from the ARGs and what we've seen from the trailers, it really seems like they're not engaging with the story yet. So I do feel that in terms of what direction Bungie goes in, I really would hope that, despite anything about whether I like hero shooters as a concept or I like the characters themselves, I just hope that we do really lean into the story aspect of the individual characters. That if you're going to give us a glitch and a void, and you're going to make them interesting like we're seeing in the cinematic, and giving them these personality traits and these backgrounds, I want to see that expanded on in a way that is, tangential even to the experience that we're having match to match. You know what I mean? It has to be grounded in some way to the story. It has to be relevant. And so if we just entirely hand wave the fact that we're these individual characters and we're running into copies of ourselves in the map, I don't know if that would make for a satisfying narrative experience in the long run, especially across multiple seasons, okay? So to get back to this kind of initial question of how to integrate runners, or how they may be integrated into the story, given that we really don't see how they impact the world around us outside of the cinematic that Alberto Mialgo had worked on, which was incredible. Here's how I think that it may work and how it may make sense within the greater context, and then simultaneously allow people to kind of have the experience of being an individual while also creating characters that have a grander impact on the story. Okay, so one of the key things I want to go back to is that in the gameplay overview trailer, we get the language from the announcer there that the runners are these mercenaries who've entirely abandoned their physical form and are now relegated to these synthetic forms. So what we believe occurred is that there's these humans, right? And they have this backstory and history, and they took their consciousness and they moved it over to a digital housing on a server. Now, whether that's a literal transfer of memories and consciousness, or it's a duplication, a copy and paste of those, we don't really know yet. And we even get the language, maybe it was in the contracts, I forget exactly where, but that the runners' minds have been partitioned. Partition, obviously draws to mind this kind of separation of these data sets, right? So the idea seems to be presenting that the runner's mind is cut and paste onto a server, and from there, multiple copies, duplicates of the amalgamation of data that makes up the personality of this runner is now stored in separate places and can be individually injected into the synthetic frames. Now, this would explain how we have these multiple iterations of runners running around the map, inhabiting the same forms, but obviously separate times and place, and completing multiple contracts. And in a dystopian kind of science fiction world, it would make sense that these mega corporations are going to cut any corners that they can to get an edge up and to have a larger amount of labor. And that does make sense when you think about the fact that they do have a large control over the actual stored information that make up these runners. So why wouldn't they make copies of them so that they have more assets that they can utilize to conduct tasks? I mean, this really is like a Clone Wars style. Why have an army of soldiers that are all separate when you can just clone one person who's a great soldier and make an army of people to conduct much larger operations? You know what I mean? And the synergy that might necessarily come with that. So it makes sense to me that potentially what they're doing is just copy and pasting a bunch of instances of these runners, using them for a bunch of tasks all at once, and then only paying one instance or iteration of that individual. Or potentially I could see a reality where this could just be a program where back on Mars or somewhere else entirely separate from what we're seeing and experiencing in the game, humans are, hey, I have this background experience in combat, I have this background experience as a hacker, whatever it is. I'm going to allow you to take a copy of my mind and you can go create a bunch of instances of it to run operations for you wherever. And in return, you're going to pay me. That maybe these runners that we're playing as in the game, in the actual, on Tau Ceti in the Biomata, are not actually receiving genuinely any of the compensation for the tasks we're completing, but potentially that's being rerouted back to a separate individual that is like our original, our source construct that exists in a physical human body. And maybe they don't even have any idea of what's occurring here. And the credits and money that we're earning, in Tau Ceti is entirely a fabrication meant to kind of placate the runner minds that are housed within the Biomata there, to allow them to feel like they have a level of autonomy, when in actuality that's been entirely stripped from them, and we are just pawns in this massive, game of chess between all of these other entities that exist out there. Now, how do you explain the fact that I'm running around as a blackbird and I see another blackbird, and yet we're not making any conversation? Blackbird's not having this moment where they're pointing a gun at themselves and thinking, oh my God, what the fuck is going on? This seems wildly inappropriate because I'm a person and I'm inside of this Biomata, and now you've created another iteration of me. Does that thing have the same rights as me? Is it me? What's going on? So I guess there's two potential answers to that. One would be that Blackbird knew. So the initial iteration of Blackbird knew that that's what they were going to be doing, that the copies and duplicates is something that was going to be okay, and thus this Blackbird inside the Biomata understands that as well. So when they see themselves, they go, that's just a clone of me. I knew that was going to happen. Kind of like this situation, and I don't know if you guys have seen Black Mirror, but there's this two-part episode. I think the latest season has the second part of it, where people can take samples of DNA and then create genetic clones from that point in time inside of a virtual universe, and they're entirely sentient, and it's like outlawed technology. Very cool. If you haven't seen it, maybe I'll put the title of that episode in the video so you can go check it out. But maybe that initial version of Blackbird knew that that's how the runner was going to be used. So when Blackbird sees another, Blackbird in the world, they make no comment about it because that's just the way things are. And ultimately they know that that's occurring. So there's no need to be unsettled by that fact. I do feel like that's kind of cheapening the experience, because then you would assume that the Blackbird inside the Biomata would have a level of resentment for the original Blackbird that existed in a human body somewhere else, because now the new Blackbird probably feels like, okay, why did you fate me to this terrible existence where every time I blink into life, I'm trapped inside a non-human body and I'm fighting for my life on this planet? It almost seems like that would lead to a kind of runner rebellion. And maybe that is kind of where they're heading. The language from the cinematic, which we believe is maybe Durandal speaking, this Ozymandias poem, I think that Durandal would really sympathize with the runners if that's the case. And if the runners are aware of it, maybe they would have this conversation with AI and understand, well, I am a sentience that's coming entirely from a synthetic storage device, and you are a sentience that's coming entirely from synthetic parts as well. So maybe there's a little bit of humanity between that shared experience that allows them to unite and team up. And maybe that is where the story is going to go. The other option, which I do think kind of lends itself a little bit more to being true, is that there could be a level of tampering going on within the constructed mind of a Void, a Blackbird, or a Glitch by the AI or whoever's housing them in whatever servers that they're stored in, assumedly in orbit of Tau Ceti 4, I think is what's going on. Is that in orbit of Tau Ceti 4, there's a ship and it has this consciousness, storage center, and that's where they're uploading the constructs from the, data set to the actual biomata. I think that's what's occurring, but we don't really know. And we even get language within the contracts, I believe, for New Caloric, where Gaius talks about the faster than light capabilities that Traxxas has developed, and that data still transfers, better than tissue. So potentially that storage facility, I guess, could be on Mars, which, if that's the case, right, and they're just transferring the data from an entirely different solar system, hundreds of light years away in a different direction, then that really opens us up to a lot more opportunities, because now we are technically existing outside of the Tau Ceti star system, which could lead to later seasons having us running around on Mars or Earth, which is kind of a crazy thing to imagine Marathon, because obviously all of the Marathon games have taken place outside of Sol. So the idea of coming back to Sol and seeing what Sol is like in the 29th century is kind of this profoundly cool thing. But taking a step back a little bit, if that's the case, right, and they're being stored somewhere, and that's controlled by AI, right, the constructs, the minds of the runners, then who's to say that that actual data could not be changed or altered in some way so that they wouldn't worry about these kinds of questions? Giving the runners this goldfish style memory, because we as in Megacorps or AI, right, have complete and total control over how their minds actually function when we place them inside the biomata. Maybe that aspect of their consciousness is being removed or altered, so that when they see these things, like different iterations of themselves running around, it doesn't even process as why that would potentially be alarming. Another thing that might indicate that this is the route that they're going in is that in the cinematic, we see these entirely abstract, feats of physics occurring on the planet that the runners really make no reference of. We have, just bringing back to mind here, I have that shot of Glitch and Blackbird, and they, after Locust dies and they're leaving before they get killed in that compound facility where Void chases Glitch. They're walking through and they see this spiralized floating rock structure. They see all these planets on the horizon, all these moons that are like, abnormally close. The size doesn't make sense. There's a lot of things that are occurring that are so outside the realm of what is possible in physical reality. And seemingly, the laws of physics do still largely apply, and things are very similar. There's structures and cars and rows, and we're standing on the ground. We're on Tau Ceti 4. So seeing these things, they do give pause, or they look at it for a moment, but it's not one of these like, holy shit, what is going on here? This is, mind-blowing kind of thing that we would imagine. Now, maybe that's their exposure to the anomaly and they already know these things, but it does feel like something that if it was more astounding to them, they would take more note of potentially, and maybe they are, and we just haven't gotten it yet. But it does seem like they're so numb to how strange things are here that potentially the part of their mind that would process any of this as strange maybe has been removed or altered in such a way. Another thing that kind of is like a big question for me is when Blackbird and Void get to that facility that I was talking about where Void chases Glitch and ultimately ends up dying. When they get there, Void gives the music, the little music player to Blackbird, and then she gives it back to him. She says something along the lines of, "You ever wonder what happened to these people?" I think that's what the line is exactly. And that's just such a interesting thing for Blackbird to say at that point in time, because it really does make it seem like, well, you have no idea what happened to these people? Really? Like, that's kind of confusing. I mean, given what you just went through, seeing how the structures have been abandoned, like looking at this anomalous gravity fields, like you probably have some idea of what occurred. I mean, the people in Seoul probably have some idea of what's going on. That, it's public knowledge that the Marathon mission left. They went to this other planet, and then we lost contact with them. I mean, it seems like the natural human conclusion you would come to is that, well, something either killed them, a virus, something in space, or aliens. Like, aliens, I don't feel like would be so outside the realm of possibility in the 29th century that people would never even suspect or think that something like that would happen. I mean, even the idea that in the 25th century is when the Marathon mission started, it's like we hadn't even left our solar system then. I guess another gap in information that might explain that could be that in between 2400 and 2890s, when we assume that we're playing as, within the game, that potentially humanity has sent other missions out beyond Seoul in opposite directions or other directions, or established colonies, or, done whatever to make us have a greater understanding of the depths of space. And maybe we haven't encountered any aliens, and so that's so far outside the realm of what people think is possible that Blackboard doesn't even entertain that as idea of what's occurring. But the language here just feels so... It seems like they know so little that it's unrealistic. Because even a Void or a Blackbird or a Locust, who's part of the UESC, you would think would have some idea, right, of what is occurring here. And that conversation surely would have happened prior to this point. And if we're really thinking about timeline, I don't know how canonized certain elements of it are, but if we look at the ARG in 2023, we seem to get indicated that the events are happening in May of 2893 when we're seeing the actual, White Rabbit shooting the UESC runner. We believe the UESC evidence files are indicating that's 2893, and I'm pretty sure that the stuff from this ARG, when we're seeing the on-the-ground kind of stuff, is indicating that it's in September of that same year. So May to September potentially has, this large period of time where runner operations are being conducted on Tau Ceti, and maybe memories are being made, experiences are being had by these runners who are involved with this. And it's like, those runners, one, would know about the past 400 years of human history and would have some contextual understanding of what could have happened to the people here. And it just seems like that's a very strange thing for Blackbird to ask. Also, why not refer to them as colonists? Do they not even know that this is a colony? It really draws a bigger question, which is, what if the runners know nothing? What if the runners know literally nothing at all? What if they are entirely blank slates, and what they're experiencing moment to moment is built on whatever logic that they had from the moment prior? If this grounding exercise that we're seeing within the cinematic trailer, or do you recognize this picture? Where's your grounding object? If the true nature of why that's needed is far more than, some memories get lost or jumbled when you have the biomoda transfer, and it really is something where it's like, no, you're completely kind of memento style, goldfish, moment to moment understanding reality around you, that really paints the runners in a much different light in what their experience is. And I do believe that largely would explain why, it makes sense to have these consistent hero characters here, and how that ties into the narrative and their awakening and acknowledgement, or coming to an understanding of what is really happening in these situations, could be tied into the story in a very cool way. And I, like I said earlier, really do hope that that's the direction that they go in. So I guess in conclusion, I think that what they're planning to do is that we have some huge key piece of information missing as to what the runners understand. That we're either, like we've talked about in the end of cinematic, and we get that, I believe it's 3400s date printed on Glitch, either we're like way outside the realm of the time period that we think we're in, or the runners themselves are very, very, very much so disconnected from reality. That, this probably explains why it's not adding up entirely to us as to how the runners fit into the story components of the game. And with that being said, this would lead into a very potentially cool narrative that sees the runners awakening to what's happening around them. Neo understanding that he's within the Matrix. And this could be a very, very interesting story to tell in parallel to the story of what the mega corporations are doing in Tau Ceti and what actually happened to the colony and, the nuance and intrigue that exists within that mystery. So if they do go in that route and they create these parallel stories, maybe one is more hidden. Maybe the story of the runners is kind of that more secret story that you have to really follow or complete much higher in-game level seasonal objectives to obtain, or maybe it's the other way around and the story of the runners is much more integral to the moment-to-moment, season-to-season story, but the understanding of the larger universe is that kind of background story. I think adding those two things in parallel could be very, very good. And especially when played out on a long enough time scale over multiple seasons or years, I could envision a reality where that's very satisfying. I think the one misstep that introduction of the runners into the narrative, the one misstep could be if they entirely disregard that and just the runners look cool and it's better to have characters from a design perspective exclusively, or it's better to have characters because it's easier to integrate that into building a following around the game or having somebody that you play consistently or, whatever. If it's really just tied to gameplay aspects or marketing aspects or something like that, then it would be disappointing in the long run. But given everything that we've seen from the Marathon's narrative team, we know Robert McLeese from the original games is working out. We know John Goff has put together these beautiful ARGs, and we know Julian Nardin, who I believe maybe just changed position as well, seems to be, a very talented writer. All these people seem to really know what they're doing, and what they've shown so far has been inspiring, obviously, to me and a lot of people who've connected with the story of Marathon. So I don't believe that's what they're going to do, but that, I think, could be the one thing that would be really kind of a misstep, in my opinion, in terms of the story, is if they don't lean into utilizing these characters as, major pieces of the story going forward in some capacity. And I think we're going to have to rely on the narrative component of this to build a greater understanding as to why they chose to really hammer in on that hero aspect, especially if we don't get any more contextual explanation from the gameplay designers or Joe Ziegler that really dives deep into that concept. But this is a ramble. I think I'm going to do more videos like this because I have topics I don't really feel like need a super well-constructed, written component to it, a script to follow, but I do want to talk about for some length of time, and perhaps maybe this is enjoyable throwing in the background if you too, like me, are dying for more Marathon stuff and are always interested in more story things. So let me know your thoughts on the Biomata, the runners, down below. Let me know if you like them, if you don't like them. I know people have a lot of opinions about it. Let me know why you think they might fit in the narrative or why they may not. I appreciate you all. Have a good day. Goodbye. All right. Bye-bye now.